EdTech Mondays Africa is supported by the MasterCard Foundation Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning in ICT and is part of the Foundation's Young Africa Works programming.
Previously, on part 1 of our May special edition of EdTech Mondays Africa, we sought to find out the reason behind the inadequate ICT infrastructure and connectivity for education in Africa and how that affects education technology in the process.
I prepare my lessons using the internet, and if the Wi-Fi is finished, then it means I cannot do it.
It cannot be overemphasized that connectivity is really what makes learning possible.
Only 40% of young women have access to mobile phones and 14% have access to the internet.
Glad you could join us on our second part of our two-part series that is coming to you from the Transform Africa Summit, where we are examining what it's going to take to widen access to ICT infrastructure and connectivity for education. On this part, we'd like to examine the policies, the regulatory frameworks, as well as the pricing and costing of connectivity in sub-Saharan Africa. What are some of the policies or the lack thereof that are hindering the widening of ICT infrastructure across Africa? That is where we continue our conversation. My name is Joy Doreen Bira. Come, let's have that conversation.
Our panelists are Kudzai Carlos Chikumbirike, IT Auditor, Postal and Telecommunication Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe, POTRAZ; Gael Nsenjiyumva, President, Girls in ICT, Rwanda; Rodrigue Gigemde, Country Advisor, Benin, Smart Africa; Dr. Soglo Bienvenue, Director, Government Affairs, Africa at Intel; and Caroline Mbugua, Director, Public Policy, Sub-Saharan Africa at GSMA.
I want for us to really look into issues around policy, regulatory frameworks, but also look into private-public partnerships, just like Carlos mentioned. And I want to talk about specifically the budgets generally. If you are in the education sector, I'm sure you know that strings have to be pulled here and there to add on to the budgetary allocation, national budgetary allocation to education. On average, across sub-Saharan Africa, we do see that the education ministries are normally allocated on average about 16% of national budgets. And if you look at the population that benefit from the education ecosystem, that's pretty much more than half of the population of sub-Saharan Africa in general. So what does that say really about how we need to move this conversation forward? If we are going to invest more in ICT infrastructure, there needs to be some sort of private investment along the way. And Caroline, I want to come to you now just to hear your thoughts around policies, regulatory frameworks, but also private investments that can work for us.
If we look at how technology is progressing, looking at moving to 5G, AI, and so forth, these are electricity-hungry technologies, meaning that if we don't address the issue of reliable access to electricity, then the quality of those solutions is going to be compromised. Mm-hmm. And renewable energies is something that we need to see progressive movement towards that direction. And one way to do that is, of course, policies, as you just mentioned, policies and regulatory frameworks that can be able to allow or encourage the use of renewable energy. So solar, for instance, Africa has the solar power to power the entire of the world if it's properly harnessed and if it's properly distributed. So looking at opportunities that can enhance the harvest of solar, processing of solar to a point where you can even give back to the national grid is something that should be considered. So that the frameworks that can be put in place, for instance, taxation frameworks that will allow, sort of like import of such solutions without necessarily increasing the cost. So you talk about the issue of budget, which is, how do I say, a lot of governments in the region are currently at a crossroad, if I may call it like that, or having challenges with budget, because we have reduced donor funding. We have reduced access to loans, and even the loans we are currently servicing, the interest is skyrocketing. So what that means is that we have a resource challenge, and for governments, priority is given to investments in projects that will drive, looking at, like heavy investment like roads, bridges, dams, etc., that is perceived, important for us to keep our economies going. So you're right. It opens up an opportunity for private-public partnerships, but it needs to be in a way that is beneficial at the end of the day to the student. So what is critical to the student? Is it connectivity? Is it food, school feeding programs? Because there are also challenges that the MP from Uganda has also mentioned.
Right.
What is the environment that this child is coming from? What are the other challenges around this child that can be addressed? So looking at such things, that you partner with non-governmental organizations, partner with investors in that particular region. But the frameworks that can be put in place is looking at what incentives can be given, or what subsidies can be given, or alleviations that can be given, or to be able for somebody to be able to have such partnerships. And then, for instance, if it is I'll give an example of like a mobile operator. If you're operating in a particular region and you're able to actually get into such partnerships, what other benefits can we extend to such an investor to encourage them around their license conditions, for instance? There are license conditions that are supposed to be met, but frameworks can be put in place to be able to reduce or to be able to give some consensus in the license conditions, and also encourage partnerships with the education sector. Because as we rightfully mentioned, if we don't have connectivity in this place, then education becomes a challenge.
Gail, in regard to looking at what policies would work for us on the African continent, you're doing work with Girls in ICT, but you're also doing work with the World Bank. And I'm sure you have observed what would work in terms of policies and partnerships.
Maybe before I go into that, I'd like to piggyback onto what Caroline just said about learning from each other about what governments do. Mm-hmm. One thing that has been very instrumental in getting Rwanda from just writing policies and implementing, from writing policies to actually implementing them, is we have what we call imihigo. These are contracts that basically government institutions sign with the government. So you take the policy and break it down into actual plans. So if you want to have all secondary schools have smart classrooms, what does it require? And so we break it down into steps that can actually be measurable and monitored over time. And so I think that's something that's really been instrumental, and that I think would be very helpful for the other governments to also look into having those actual contracts signed and reviewed and be considered as KPIs in terms of the success measurement. Now, as far as policies around what to do with the World Bank in improving, we do work in the energy sector, and Imihigo is a big part of that. But what we also do is that we try to really be on the ground and understand what it requires from the bottom up in order to provide access to electricity, mm-hmm. And to understand to perform cost-benefit analysis when it comes to whether it's on-grid or off-grid work, and how this is going to provide access not just to electricity, but later on to connectivity as well. Yes.
Great. And now that we have understood that we are working with ICT infrastructure that is energy hungry, and that for every ICT innovation that is implemented in Africa, there has to be some sort of connectivity to electricity. With that in mind, how exactly do we intend to widen this access to ICT infrastructure? I don't know if, Dr. Soglo, you can share on that, as well as Rodrigue can share on that we are able to not only connect last mile electricity, but also do the same for ICT infrastructure, knowing that these two go hand in hand. I mean, what is ICT infrastructure if it's not backed by good electricity connection?
Thank you very much, Joy. And well, as you mentioned, specifically coming back to our N50 Luombo pilot, in fact, that site is powered by solar power, right? And so we understand that that piece is very critical to enable access to connectivity. But I just quickly wanted to comment on some previous intervention, talking about the cost of data, talking about relevant content and so on. In terms of this pilot, in fact, one interesting data point is that all the children reading, in addition to hundreds of digital books, they actually put into the, there's a place where you cache the content, right, to allow distribution. So those content are actually cached there. So I think that is an option, right, for people to be able to access to, to those content without necessarily going to, without necessarily having the need to go to the World Wide Web, right? So each time you go and back, then, there's a data cost there. That to be avoided. The second aspect that I want to talk about in terms of data cost, and that's why when I was explaining earlier, those data-hungry content, right? If the content is used by most people, you can look at off-peak hours, right? And then you download those content, which is cached locally, and then people will be able to access that, right? So I think that is, again, having the challenges in mind and looking at appropriate solution. That's what made us make that pilot. Quickly on the policy implications. We talk about devices. And we think it's very important to define the specifications of the devices, right? You just don't go and then get any devices. You have to tie the type of device you're using with what you are actually going to use the device for. And that has different type of specification. Other critical policy aspects that in some countries quickly, made in terms of roadmap, made available is access to spectrum, right? When we talk about last mile connectivity, you need spectrum, and therefore having access to adequate spectrum, we could say low band and mid band, looking at the communities, is critical. Both licensed spectrum, but also licensed exam, because I hear from the schools you talk about Wi-Fi, right? And so, we have a certain type of Wi-Fi spectrum that has been made available. We need additional ones, right? And so we encourage, right, the regulators to actually, as quick as they can, right, to make those spectrum available. So that is not the bottleneck, if I put it that way. One last point is that when we were looking at this pilot, and in fact the N50 project is based on an alliance. So the N50 has more than 100 partners worldwide, and specifically for this pilot, Intel has worked with the likes of Dell, the likes of EMN, that's provide network as a service. The GSMA was also involved, and so on. So I think, PPP is important. We need to focus on the problem we want to solve. What are some of the critical aspects? Financing is very important. And based on that, we'll be able to have, adequate solution.
I want to hear from you, Rodrigue, as well, regarding public-private partnerships. At Smart Africa, the alliance that you do have is not just with African countries, but I'm sure it does encourage innovators, it does encourage technology companies as well to provide solutions for the different African countries where different innovations are happening. Tell us about those and how they are encouraging not just the foundation for ICT infrastructure, but also laying the ground for an inclusive or all-inclusive education for all.
Yes, in Smart Africa, as we mentioned, we are working with a lot of partners in private sector, institution, who is working on the creation of the enforcement of infrastructures, connectivities, accessibilities, and this we have a lot of type of financial we have, and in each kind of financial we have, we try anytime to improve the tips to these partners to invest in the electricity, to invest to some kind of technology we are not improving in Smart Africa directly. So I can take an example. When you take our partner, we have our partner ITU, for example, in the project, in the Giga project. When we are working on this kind of project, we are trying to find the school where we don't have electricity, for example, and to try to make more involved some partners who are working on alternative technologies to provide and to give to some countries an adaptive technology for us. This is the lobbying we are doing with our partners. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And I guess that also does pose the question. I don't know how many African countries even have considered having EdTech specific policies to drive investment. Maybe Carlos, you could share as well in regard to whether or not there are specific policies around education technology that support the implementation of ICT infrastructure and connectivity for education.
Thank you. I think from a regulatory perspective, this is something I think other regulators may also copy and implement free of charge. The aspect of competition and pricing is also very key in making connectivity and infrastructure accessible to marginalized communities. In Zimbabwe, there's been a deliberate drive to license more players. And we have gone on another level to have special licensing models where you can have a category that's for community internet access providers, which is low cost and it opens doors to more players and it makes it more dynamic. At policy level, this is an initiative that regulators can embrace to make sure that you have got access being extended to marginalized communities. We also have got national broadband plans. The government can subsidize, access to data and things like that. But I'm also thinking that when we overplan, plan and have more plans. Once you are done with planning, you plan some more.
We need action.
You may make little progress.
Yes.
But the taste of the pudding is in the eating. Get onto the ground, begin the implementation. As you implement, you see room for improvement. And there's nothing wrong with making mistakes, because mistakes can also be corrected. In Zimbabwe, we were very excited about the CICs, which I've mentioned earlier on, Community Information Centers. But as time went on, we said, let's modify the CICs, because it's motivated by the need that you are realizing on the ground. Now we've got CVICs, Community Village Information Centers, that are more portable, more robust, and more effective. So people shouldn't be scared of getting their hands dirty, getting on to action, doing what has to be done, because sometimes improvements come as we do.
Right. And is there flexibility within the government? As we know, African governments, is there flexibility for this to happen?
Precisely, because our actions should be motivated by the need, feedback from the ultimate beneficiaries of your initiatives. So if feedback is coming in, there should be need and a justifiable reason to modify plans, to modify structures so that they actually fulfill their intended objectives.
What would best work for us in terms of widening ICT infrastructure and connectivity across the African continent? Maybe there are even partners here who have tried to implement private sector as well.
I've listened to great initiatives and investment in ICT infrastructure. But as a cybersecurity person, I am just concerned about the security and protection of these devices to our students. Have we taken into consideration this project that we are carrying out, how secure it is for our students to use it or get connected to the internet? I think as part of the policies, we should also make it part of it to implement these cybersecurity policies so that people or students who are using them will be safe and have the trust to use them as well. Because without trust, we cannot encourage this usage of ICT infrastructure and connectivities.
What we are working on or trying to do is work with partners that can help us at least develop or help the country. So what we did some years ago was help with teacher training, because we believe in them also being trained on the digital skills, because we felt teachers have to be equipped for them to be able to help the students.
Mm-hmm.
So the partners that we work with would say, okay, we want to put in infrastructure or to put gadgets where there is accessibility, where there's already electricity and where it's easier to get to. So yes, it's great, but there is a challenge. So we say to them, okay, we also want to reach those that are not in accessible areas, because
Yes.
they'll be left behind.
Mm-hmm.
So far we've been helping the ones where there's already electricity, but our cry is to also reach out those unreached. Last year we took a drive to a school where it's not very accessible and all, but there is a great need. There's just a center where they put in a few gadgets, and about 50 schools are accessing this, and you can see the appetite that's there, but there's lack of resources. So again, it's adding to the comments that are here, the energy aspect of it, the accessibility. I think we shouldn't leave anyone behind. So for us, we want to see what we can do. That's our cry, to say we want to help the country as well.
I got excited when one of our students said, I think. That means we've not yet accepted that we own and we should embrace the technology. Good leaders and other colleagues in this room, I would like to ask a question. How do we energize the community to appreciate that the technology is theirs and it should move productivity? Because at the end of the day, all this is brought, but do they appreciate that it is for them and for their own benefit? I will look at sustainability. If you take all these gadgets to schools and I won't say that dump them. Okay, you give them to schools. What happens? Can't we accompany them with a package that assists the schools to ensure that maintenance and these others, Wi-Fi and the others, at least the school should handle? So I think we should go deep into looking about sustainability. Government can't afford. The cost of maintenance of technology is high. You can't give, then maintain. So we should think about that. Then mindset change. Colleagues, when it comes to investment in technology, the investors can't tell us the private sector, but in Africa, the private sector has go through a lot to invest. Is there a political will? Actually, even the cost of technology arises out of corruption. Mm-hmm. As these come with business, how do they access business in these countries where they go? So we should have the goodwill to accept the private sector and have that cordial relationship so that you give them a working environment. The politics is too much into these investments, and it makes it costly for the private sector to cooperate. So can we have that genuine heart? Open up, give them access to business freely. But as long as you bring corruption into this, it spoils the whole story. So I'll tell you, in Uganda, we are fighting corruption versus private sector as they come to do the investment. Is it as easy as it is in other countries? So we should really have mindset change for even the leaders, from leadership to the general community. Otherwise, technology won't be embraced up to the ground. It is becoming too expensive because the investment is simply too high. So how do we simplify investment on the side of the private sector and the cordial relationship with government? And these are the key players. Thank you.
Just to add to the point about cost and connectivity, we train professionals across sub-Saharan Africa, and we can see the trends of those who get left behind because of connectivity and because of cost, because it's an e-learning platform.
Right.
So Yeah, just to comment on, we do have communities of practice in these countries where they can meet up. So you'll see that the communities of practice will dissolve, will not meet up maybe because, for example, in Zimbabwe, because of electricity challenges and costs, you'll see that that community will fall away. Or other countries who are facing political situations and they cannot connect.
We did speak to stakeholders. These are telcos, teachers, learners, as well as other stakeholders in regard to what they think about this conversation around the cost of connectivity and also the role of public-private partnerships in bringing this into a better experience for learners across the continent. Take a look at what they had to say.
As you know, ICT has become, let's say, a major part of progress, of development. You don't have it, you have no access to different opportunities around the world. Education, of course, and skill building in general is a very important part for telecommunications, ICTs in general. Digital transformations need to cover all the fields, including education. In order to connect the people, you need to have the infrastructure, the connectivity infrastructure. Whether you are in villages or in the city, you need to have connectivities. And education is not an exception. So for us, it is important that we reach out to those people who need the connection and who cannot be in the city because of their social situation and so on. And you can even not bring everybody to the city. So therefore, connectivity is the most important part of when it comes to bringing education to everyone in the countries.
I started using gadgets at a very young age. Since at work, my mom's work, they provided with laptops and phones, so she started grooming me and my brother using gadgets at a very young age.
Computers help us a lot, especially I am doing my Form 4 this year. So I have a lot of colors to research that I cannot find even in the textbooks or notes that our teacher gave us. So I use those ICT to research colors and assignments that I'll be given.
I mainly use it to research. If I have an assignment or colors, our teachers give us an opportunity to research. They give us a period of time, so it's actually helpful that we can research at home.
When we run out of data bundles, the school may not be able to process well during lesson progresses, because it may happen that a certain subject may need us all class to go and use the internet access, while there's no data, so we can't actually get to the point where we need to get because due to the limitless data bundles.
Growing up, my parents would tell me how fortunate I am, so they pay a transport to take me to school. But at rural areas, it's really difficult for children to travel going to school. But if there's digital learning at rural areas, it can curb the hassles and the dangerous hazards that they from traveling to and from school. So I'm just encouraging the government to just put more like ICT infrastructures there in rural areas so that they can encourage digital learning for the kids in rural areas.
What the government needs to do with the rural area schools who does not have the ICT tools, they have to donate the laptops or tablets to help those students get more information about, they learn how to use ICT.
I think the government needs to adjust the loss of running out of data bundles because it takes time for us to get to where we need to get due to the loss of data bundles. So if we can have more data, then I think we can have more learnings and use of those gadgets.
Thank you. And so there's so much that we can contextualize here, right from the fact that education benefits all, but then again, with education, we have already seen so many challenges. Before technology was a part of education, there were already people being left out. So technology was coming in, or
technology integrated learning was coming in to bridge the gap, the education gap that we already have on the African continent. But still now, with technology integrated learning, there are additional challenges that come with it, and cost to connectivity is one of them. Laying the infrastructure, the ICT infrastructure, right from the point in time where we had fiber optic cable laid for the very first time on the African continent, that now started to pose many other challenges because accessibility was only to just a few, and that means the rural parts, again, who were left out even with education in the first place, and now being left out as well when it comes to technology integrated learning. And that there is where we need to fix the ICT infrastructure, make it affordable, look at the support infrastructure of electricity, and also make sure that it's all inclusive to be able to support the ICT infrastructure that is energy hungry, just like Caroline put it. And so as we bring this conversation to a close, I just want to hear from our panelists as well. How do we move a conversation forward that maybe, say, over the next 5-10 years, we are going to be coming back here and talking about how much progress has been made as a result of the solutions that we have come up with. I'm going to start with Caroline. Going forward, how do we need to go about this? What would a widened ICT infrastructure platform on the African continent look like?
I think we just need to challenge ourselves to understand, how do we move from talking to action? That's just where the big dilemma is. I like what the MP from Uganda has said. How do we address, the goodwill? Because I think that's a key issue in Africa. How do we address political goodwill that will create the enabling investment environment to attract and retain investment on our continent? One thing that was mentioned from our colleague from Rwanda is something that I think in a lot of other countries is even unimaginable, where you have a contract with government on what you're supposed to deliver. I think that's really amazing, because that's something that we have in the private sector, where you have a contract with your employer on KPI, on your service delivery and how it's measured. And over and above that, they have a community engagement that is done periodically in the country, where the community themselves evaluate government services and give feedback, candid feedback to as high up as to the president. So I think having such accountability measures are very critical to ensure that the policies that we have established are actually implemented and are tracked with clear targets. Because another challenge that we have is that policies are put in place, but there are no targets that are set, saying that we are putting this policy and we'd like to move connectivity from 30% to 40% by this time by doing X. So that measuring, evaluation, accountability will be critical, because we have seen people like ITU have said that increase in adoption in broadband services can increase GDP production by up to 10% in the nation. For us to benefit from that, we have to be real and candid about our engagement and our work in terms of rolling out these frameworks that we have developed.
Gail, I want to hear from you as well regarding the future and how best we can optimize public-private partnerships to make sure that it's not just the government that we're leaving the implementation part to, because the government can only implement so much. What else can we do as stakeholders to make sure that this is serving the purpose of education for all?
Thank you, Joy. As you mentioned, and rightly so, government can only do so much, but government can put in place favorable environments for the private sector to also come in and act. And that is where we encourage people to also come up with innovative solutions on how to address these issues. So if we cannot have, for example, access in every home, can we have those community internet centers where they can come and get access there? At least that way, as we're trying to fix the ICT infrastructure issue, we're raising the digital literacy of the population, and those two should go hand in hand. We should not wait for the infrastructure to get there before re-raise the digital literacy. So we're able to do some things as we wait for the infrastructure to attain every area, but we really need to also focus on that digital literacy aspect to ensure that once the infrastructure is there, the people are ready to use the systems.
Dr. Soglo, I want to hear from you. Going forward, how do you think we need to go about widening access to ICT infrastructure and connectivity for education?
In fact, I want to use one data point which is really important and then come to what they just said. And as Caroline mentioned earlier, there's a study by the ITU that said a 10% increase in broadband penetration has, a GDP contribution around 2.4% in developing countries. You can see clearly the benefit. But the MP mentioned a very important aspect, which is that we go to the communities, we believe that we understand what the problems are, we bring in the infrastructure, at the end of the day, they are not using them.
Right.
So how do we solve that? So from our perspective, and that has been one of the thinking behind this pilot, is that you have to go to those communities, understand what are the challenges, what they really need. And in fact, if there's a possibility to have in those communities entities that are maybe offering something that is related to education, and then the people are willing to use it. So there's already the willingness of the people in the community to use it. Mm-hmm. Then we can come in and say, hey, you know what? We have this infrastructure that we can add to that to help you grow that. So I think that's a very, very important aspect to not only address the need for the people to believe that we are helping them to improve education, but also to ensure sustainability.
Right.
Because if you can sustain, actually, whatever you put in place, I think, at the end of the day, a couple of years later, we see that it didn't work, but we want something that worked. Finally, in conclusion, what I want to say is that meaningful connectivity is key to the success of building solutions like the one that we're conducting now with N50 in Luombo that have enduring value. And, well, you need hardware, you need software, but you also need the devices with the required capabilities. I think also that aspect is also a very important aspect, because sometimes we think that, well, okay, for access to education, we just need a certain type of device because, it can just work. But it is important to have technical specifications that are adapted to the solution, in this case, to the education. Because also, different age group of students, they need different type of devices, right? The students that are in primary school, middle school, or at the university, they need different type. It won't be the same type of devices.
Yes.
And therefore, I think a holistic view of how this problem can be solved need to be looked at. I believe we have the solutions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Soglo, for that. Rodrigue, going forward, Smart Africa has a lot of work to do. We want to hear from you and how you intend to make us as learners part of the entire ecosystem in terms of ICT infrastructure and connectivity.
It's really important for us to have a target. And this target is really important to have an innovative target, to have impact for the education. And as I say in my first intervention, I'm talking about policies. I talk about policies. On my side, I think that it's really important for us to reinvent the implementation of these policies to accelerate, because we need to accelerate. Somebody says that it's really important to make more involvement for the private sector. Actually, we are we are creating policies, but for the implementation, we are not really involved the private sector. That is really important to have, like in industry, in smart devices, to reduce the cost, to reinvent also the way of accessibility to connectivity. So we have to try to work on the support for member states to have adapted policies to make more involved private sector and to have a innovative and great target.
Carlos, I'm going to give you the last word. How do we move forward? How do we ensure that we are dealing with the challenges and not just talking? I believe everybody in the room is tired of talking. We now just need action points. How do we ensure we're doing this in the process of widening infrastructure and connectivity?
No one can go it alone. And the future is bright, it's full of potential, but really no one can go it alone.
Mm-hmm.
There is need for cross-sectorial collaboration. The technology sector, the energy sector, at some point need to realize they need to come together, even cross-national collaboration. This is why initiatives like this one by the MasterCard Foundation is very critical to bring the minds together. We need each other to navigate the digital complexities and unleash each other's potential for growth. And as we embrace technology, I think let's hold hands together. Let's be there for each other as different sectors, as different countries, as different minds, so that we'll really become our brother's keeper, like the biblical Cain. He later on became the brother's killer. If we don't help each other, we are really killing each other.
If we're not helping each other, we are killing each other. And I like the part that you mentioned, we really need multi-sectoral partnerships, because that really is important. If we're not working together, if the Ministry of Education is not working with the Ministry of ICT, there's definitely going to be a challenge there. And the Ministry of Energy as well. Those three key ministries are very crucial to making sure we're bridging that gap and providing and widening access to ICT infrastructure and connectivity for education. And the MasterCard Foundation as well has played a role in extending devices. In Rwanda, under the learning, the LEAD program, we have seen that 1,000 laptops, for every 1,000 laptops given out to teachers or teaching assistants, the outcome is immense. It means that this is transferable as well to the learners, and that there is where the change begins to happen, is where the impact begins to happen, because when you have empowered educators, it makes it easier for the learners as well to catch on with technology, and it makes it easier for them to adapt for the future and gain digital skills as well, which are very crucial when it comes to widening ICT infrastructure and connectivity access as well. And so we've talked about cost and everything, and I believe that this conversation is one that opens up avenues for even greater solutions on the African continent.
Thank you all for joining us in this edition of EdTech Monday Africa that was coming to you from the Transform Africa Summit. And thank you also to our panelists and contributors who have made this conversation around widening access to ICT infrastructure and connectivity for education even more worthwhile. And we look forward to having more conversations like this that look forward to providing solutions for education technology across the continent. My name is Joy Doreen Bira. Thank you all for being part of the show.
EdTech Mondays Africa is supported by the MasterCard Foundation Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning in ICT and is part of the Foundation's Young Africa Works programming.